So let's go ahead and just start with a little meditation. I like to start all my classes with just taking a few minutes to close our eyes and let our attention sink into our bodies and arrive fully in this present moment. You can use the tool of the breath as an anchor for your attention. Feeling the expansion with each inhale and release with each exhale. Letting the inhale travel your body, notice whatever might be coming up for you in this moment. If there's any tension, nervousness, excitability, heaviness. And using the exhale to release whatever you just noticed. It's like water through your fingers. And again, with the inhale, just noticing and releasing with the exhale. And that exhale to clean out an open interior space, fully present in this moment. And two themes I'm going to invite you to bring into your consciousness to play with briefly here. The duality between grief and love. And we're just going to take a minute, so you don't have to touch on anything that's going to feel overwhelming to you, but maybe it's just a tightness in your body that's related to a loss, or an awareness of your body that leads you to a blissful feeling. Or maybe it's the loss of having to let go of a thought that you were mulling over before you arrived here. And just toggling between those two feelings of love and loss. Noticing the absence and noticing the full presence that arrives behind it and with it. You can notice the arrival of presence and love and care for your body in the inhale, and the releasing in the exhale. And your ability to easily move between those two. Just a few more breaths here. And then opening your eyes when you're ready. I'm going to bring up my screen share here. Let's see if I can preserve my presenter notes while I'm looking at it. Okay, so we're going to be looking at fractals as transformational knowledge today, because like Jake said, a lot of the classes that I teach are pretty heavy in math and science. And so that's an experience in and of itself, which can bring up a lot of emotions for people. So another way that I start my classes is working with Joanna Macy's The Spiral of the Work That Reconnects. So Joanna Macy, for those of you who don't know, is an environmental activist and Buddhist scholar living there in Berkeley, who's done a ton of amazing work to help facilitate this mutually enhancing relationship between humans and the earth that we as a Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program, and as an institution of CIIS, are trying to continually stoke and amplify and find new ways and old ways to help the flourishing of the earth. And so part of her work is really honoring pain for the world. And I use this as a model to honor our pain with math and science also as we approach these subjects. When we bring our fullness to our subject and allow ourselves to feel the fullness of emotions around it, then we can open to that. If we're holding pain around it, we might be defended or blocked off, and that knowledge might be inaccessible to us. Once we acknowledge any pain that might be held around that, then we have a greater freedom of movement with it, a greater openness to it. And there's something about math and science in particular that epitomizes this impulse of the Western mind towards rationality, which we have seen the destructive effects of in the world. And so the pain might not even be personal, it might be for the world and for the challenges that we have brought through our adherence to rationality, through our adherence to black or white, right or wrong thinking. And often this is what, when somebody approaches these subjects, feelings of inadequacy may come up because they may have felt on the wrong side of the right-wrong divide. And by honoring that other space outside of right and wrong, we have this opportunity to honor the wildness. The wildness of the grief and the sense of loss that comes up. It allows the wild to find a place to snuggle up alongside rationality. And I bring this up because as I've been preparing this presentation, I've been sitting with a small loss of my own, and a cat who passed away this week and had been sick for a little while, so holding space for that. And feeling a great deal of emotion around that. And at the same time, recognizing my tendency to judge that emotion and to judge the smallness of the loss of a pet. And so finding ways to honor that. And so the development of this presentation has been different than much of my work normally, because I've been feeling these very slow, undulating, bottom-up processes of allowing the emotion to be present and to inform the material. And so as part of that process, and recognizing really that the denigration of our relationship to animals and our relationship to plants is part of what we're trying to heal. We're trying to honor our relationship to the natural world as something worthy of celebrating and grieving. And so as part of my process to feel into this, I went back to Martine Fractals' book, The Smell of Rain on Dust, Grief and Praise. Martine Fractal is of First Nations Canadian and Swiss descent. He was raised on a Pueblo reservation and trained and practiced as a Mayan shaman in Guatemala for 13 years. And he has a really beautiful way of talking about pet loss in this book in particular, such that he talks about kind of the origins of pets in a tribal context of being grief orphans, where if a person was hunting and killed the parent of a baby animal, often they would take that baby animal home and nurture it. And so there's this reminder of those who feed us in our pets in our lives, and a reminder of our indebtedness to those who feed us. That helps our animal soul, and this is a quote from him, feel a little less orphaned by our domestication. When a pet leaves us, we are orphaned to our own stale domestication. Yet in our grief, we continue to touch the wildness of being. because grief is this wildness, this unpredictability that comes up inside of us. And he has a beautiful passage where he talks about the way grief taps into previous griefs. And that anytime we grieve, it's a floodgates for all of our griefs to come forward. And this is a fundamentally fractal phenomenon, in that there are patterns that translate across scale and across time and place, and that map onto each other and that bring each other present. And so I'm going to read his description of these griefs upon griefs tapping into each other while we're watching the Mandelbrot set zoom in. That's the image that's on the screen right now. And so what I want you to notice is the way patterns repeat as we zoom into this image, and feeling into how the words might intertwine with this particular model. So he says, and of course, because grief does not prefer elitist loneliness, but is a wholly gregarious democrat. Often when a pet owner begins to weep for that one dead creature, all the losses they could never weep about, all the unsung sorrows, all the undanced grief tangos, all the irrational praise poems begin to flood the dance floor of the human heart. Begin their collective grief mambo of sorrow for all their unwept losses at one time. Their dead grandfather, their dead mother, an old lost love, their home or country taken away. Every single forgotten thing, and sorrow surges to the fore, weeping, sighing, laughing. Real pets make us this way, because the way we are loved by animals and the way we love animals forces us a little into an older way of loving life from a former time in history when we were a natural, more human animal. So we experience this fractal self-similarity inside of ourselves. Any first experience with grief or loss then becomes a touchstone, a returning place every time we experience grief or loss again. Surrounding and encapsulating and nesting all of these experiences within one another. We've de-emphasized the full love that animals bring to us and that we bring to them in favor of rationality and power. But luckily, rationality finds its limits, and this is really what I try to teach. So standing in the lineage of Thomas Berry's call to do the great work, to cultivate the mutually enhancing relationship of humans and the earth, of ourselves and earth. Knowing that the earth is the universe coming alive and that we are the earth gaining self-awareness. Then the question is, how do we do this? Knowing these things, how do we create a mutually enhancing relationship with the earth? And I'm going to pull in Masanobu Fukuoka's quote also, that the healing of the land and the purification of the human spirit is the same process. He's a do-nothing farmer, working very much to step into the flow of the energy of nature and to help facilitate that. So this is the mutually enhancing relationship with the earth. Steps into the flow of what nature is already doing and is himself enhanced by that and is able to then work with it in order to further amplify what's already happening. And so how do we become mutually enhancing with Earth? Allowing the self-awareness of Earth, which we are becoming, to fall in love with life again, to fall in love with Earth again, including all the bliss, all the messiness, all the pain and learning that that entails, and to expand our self, small s self, to a big S self, and to understand we are Earth, we are the universe. So what's the problem? Self-awareness falls in love with the power gained through rationality and finds this to be a barrier to continuing to expand to encompass the experience of all beings. And so how do we facilitate the rational falling in love with the more than rational? And luckily, we don't really have to. There's this beautiful principle that Jung popularized, enantiodromia, where anything taken to its extreme becomes its opposite. And so this is the same tendency of the Western mind, that we want. The Western thought and science is driven by this drive to analyze, to objectify, to measure by an either or logic, to predict and to control and to find that which is objectively true. Luckily, it finds its own limits in modern physics. And so modern physics brings us the reality of the context, of the relative notion of truth, of both and, of uncertainty through probability, and of co-creativity and participation in the world. And so if we just continue following that trajectory of the rational mind, we actually get back to this more holistic way of being in the world. And this process that is happening right now, we can actually amplify and contribute to. And this is what I'm trying to do in my work by showing rationality, how it can get back to wholeness with the gifts that it has cultivated, and allowing some of its greater struggles and challenges to be left by the wayside. And so in teaching this, modern physics consists of quantum mechanics, relativity, chaos and complexity theory, and look at entropy and dissipative structures are some of the main categories that I draw in many of my classes. And each of these have their own ways of returning rationality to a holistic perspective. And the one we're going to focus on today is fractals, because that's my favorite. And so there are a number of ways that fractals returns rationality to beauty and mystery. First of all, they are pervasive in nature. So by recognizing fractals in nature through, and let me just give a definition of what a fractal is real quick. They're a collection of objects in mathematics that were ignored for a long time because they involve infinities, and mathematicians don't like to deal with infinities. And so they became studied more extensively, not until the 80s, when computing technology allowed us to plow through greater amounts of data and produce things like the Mandelbrot set that we meditated on for the self-similarity, the bringing in the pattern of grief and all of the griefs that came with it. That wasn't necessarily visible in the same way before we had computers. But there had been other versions of fractals that were visible and swept to the side because they were monsters, too difficult to deal with, not simple enough for the rationality of mathematics. And basically, the one thing that unites them all is an irregularity or a roughness. It is not a straight line. Nature is not smooth. Everywhere you look, if you think you see a smooth line and you zoom in, you will see irregularity the closer you zoom in. And then you may think you see another straight line and you zoom in a little bit more and you'll see even more irregularity. So that's the foundational piece of fractals. Often this manifests as this patterning across scale. So a tree that splits into two branches, that splits into more branches, that splits into more branches, is a branching pattern across scale and allows for and optimization within constraint. And I've got pictures for that. So I'm going to finish this slide first and give you the overview, then we'll go through the pictures. So we've got the pervasiveness in nature, recognizing that fractals are all around us. They build our own bodies. We see them in space, we see them in Earth, we see them in ourselves. And so this nested way of being in the world and recognizing ourselves as part of and an emergent property of is inherent in this way of seeing the world. There's the self-similarity, there's an infinite within the finite, which is the zooming in across levels of scale. And there's the fractal dimension, which gives us relationship to any time we find a power law in nature. So let's go through some of these properties and see a little bit more about how they show up. So the pervasiveness in nature. So I mentioned the branching that we see in a tree, or that how we use to model our own family trees, our ancestors or our descendants. Anytime we have something that is increasing exponentially with a jump in linear scale, we have a branching pattern, we have a power law. And Laurent Notal, who's a French astrophysicist who has a fractal model of space-time, talks about fractals as an optimization within constraint. And so if we think about a tree that has a finite volume that wants to maximize its sunlight gathering surface area, it has to do that by spreading out, right? Maximizing surface area within the constraint of a finite volume. And we see this not only in trees, but in our own vasculature, our own watersheds of our nervous system that flow into our brain, our sensory neurons in the watershed, and our motor neurons as the river deltas, taking in and giving back information into the heart, the vasculature of veins and arteries, taking in and giving out to facilitate oxygenation of a total volume, maximizing the surface area so that those veins and arteries can reach every cell in the body. So there's also this sense of roughness, which yields an unpredictability. So in mathematics, predictability is often called something that is differentiable. A straight line moving at an angle like this, we could say, okay, well, we can measure exactly what the rise over run is. And so we can guess, okay, if it's here, it's going to go up this much and over that much in this much time, and we're going to know where it's going to be next. It's predictable. We can take the derivative, which is what makes it differentiable, and that tells us where is it going to be next. The Weierstrass function, which we can see here on the screen, is continuous everywhere, but it's differentiable nowhere. So everywhere it looks like there might be a straight line, when you zoom in, it becomes a jaggedy line. And you zoom in a little bit further, and that's a jaggedy line. You zoom in a little bit further to where you think might be a straight line, and that's a jaggedy line. And so there's this sense in which it is unpredictable, because we can never say exactly where it's going next. With that straight line, you might think, oh, it's here, it's going to be here next, but actually there's a little zigzag in there before it gets to that next position. And so there's this sense of unpredictability that flies in the face of classical physics, which was trying to predict and explain everything. So this is one of the principles of modern physics that shows up in all of those different realms I was talking about, especially in quantum mechanics also. And we see this irregularity around us in nature in mountains. If you look at a mountain range on the skyline, you can tell that it's not predictable. And if you zoomed in on what looks like a flat slope, you're going to see boulders undulating. If you zoom in on a boulder, you're going to see undulations of that surface also. So there's this notion of irregularity across scale that actually creates an infinite depth within a finite space. And so this is the Koch curve that we're looking at right here, and I'm using it to illustrate a principle called the coastline paradox, which was actually developed by a mathematician who was trying to prove that the length of a border between two countries would predict the level of frequency that they would come into conflict, like the level of warfare between those countries. And what he found was that as he started to try to collect data on how long was this border between countries, all of the measurements were completely different. He could not find a definitive measurement for the length of a border. And what he found was that that was because it depended on the length of the measuring stick you were using as to the length of the border. And so this is often called the coastline paradox because it was popularized talking about the coastline of Britain. If we're going to measure the coastline of Britain, what is that length going to be? And the idea is that if you use a measuring stick that's a mile long and you start putting that around any island, you're going to get one measurement for the perimeter of that island. But if you use a shorter measuring stick, all of a sudden you start incorporating more of those little twists and turns of the boundary, and the actual measurement that you get is going to be much longer. So you can see this illustrated here, that if we just measure, if we ignore all these little twists and turns of the Koch curve, then we get a measurement of 6, whatever you want to call those, inches, or depending on how big they are on your screen. Whereas if we use a shorter measuring stick with a length of 2, then we can start to take into account some of the irregularity of that shape, and we get a measurement of 8. And down here on the bottom, when we're using a measuring stick that is half a unit long, then we get to incorporate even more of these little nooks and crannies, and we get a measurement of 12. And so this is the idea that there is some uncertainty and there's a relationality in measuring that happens that we have to take into account. And the beauty of this phenomenon is that this infinity with infinitude, that by zooming in, you can keep zooming in forever, just like the Mandelbrot set that we were looking at the beginning of this session. When you can keep zooming in forever, you recognize this infinity held with infinitude. So this pattern of the Koch curve is built in a way I'm going to show you in a second. But basically, well, here, let's just toggle between the slides here. So this is the Koch snowflake. If you start with a triangle, flip over another triangle, make a Star of David, or you can look at it as taking any flat side of that triangle and bumping out a smaller triangle on that flat side. Boop, boop, boop. Then in this next iteration, each of those flat sides of that triangle can be bumped out and form another little triangle on top. And in the next iteration, each of those flat sides has a tiny little triangle bumped out. And so in this sense, this iterative process can go on forever, and you can end up with, the snowflake is still a finite size, a finite, within a finite perimeter, within a finite surface area, but its perimeter becomes infinite. Its coastline becomes infinitely large. And so this is a beautiful way to encompass some of the wisdom that we know, going back to this William Blake quote, to see the world in a grain of sand and a heaven and a wildflower, to hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour, is to acknowledge the way infinity fits into finitude. And so fractals do this really beautifully. And so not only do they fit infinity into finitude through this repetition of pattern across scale, because it's a dialogue between the microscopic pattern, the individual pattern, and the macroscopic pattern, that large pattern that gets iterated across scale, that allows us to relate. If we see ourselves as one pattern and the larger universe is another pattern, there's this micro-macro reflection that happens. And there's also a reflection between self and other, a recognition of the similarity of pattern. Fractal dimensionality is describing how much of another dimension something is taking up. So if I take a straight line and crinkle it up a little bit, it was a one-dimensional line, but if I crinkle it up, now it's gained some thickness. Now it has moved into a second dimension. And so a fractal dimension is just a fraction describing how much of that second dimension it's taken up. So for the Koch curve here, the fractal dimension is 1.2619, etc. And so it's no longer just a one-dimensional line. It has this 0.26 of the second dimension of height that it's taking up. And so this idea can be used in many different phenomena and is fundamentally a power law phenomenon. It's describing how densely packed something is. And I ventured to describe in my next presentation later today, we'll talk a little bit more about how we can think about time as a fractal dimension of space, how we continually deepen into time, into timelessness, creating temporality by these repetitions without fully creating a whole other dimension, but by slowly stepping into and building out the density of time in space. I'm not going to go into those specifically, but I do want to mention that the Mandelbrot set, so here's another version. You can see the upper left-hand image starting with that big Mandel bulb, it's called, and then that little box is showing where the next image to the right zooms in to that first image. And then this box right here is showing where this next image zooms in. And then this image zooms into this whole box and then down to here. And so the Mandelbrot set is actually a boundary between difference, between bounded and unbounded points. And this is one of the most beautiful qualities of fractals that I like to come back to is this unfurling of complexity at the interface of difference. This is where all the beauty happens. And so the Mandelbrot set is actually just one line. It's the line between the colored portions and the black portion of the set. It is created by this pretty simple formula down here. There's one point taken on the plane, and that point is squared and added to itself, and that gives you the next point. And you're just letting that point bounce around on the plane until it jumps outside of a certain radius. Once it jumps outside of that certain radius, it's labeled as unbounded. And the number of times it had to jump around to get there gives it a color. So that first point is colored by the number of times it had to jump around before it gets out of that box. And so every point on the plane gets a color based on whether it's unbounded, if it ever escaped that radius, or if it's bounded, in which case it's black. So all of the black points in the Mandelbrot set are still bouncing around in there. We haven't had enough computing power to find out if they ever escape or not. And so it's an unknown quantity. We don't know if they ever escape or not. And the idea with the Mandelbrot set is that everywhere you zoom into on the set is a boundary between black and color. You just have to zoom in close enough to find it. But everywhere on that plane is a boundary. And so in this sense, it is one line that has been folded back on itself so much that it creates an entire two-dimensional plane. And so this is another piece of the magic of fractals that returns us to these fundamental dualities that we deal with in our lives and that are sources of creativity and birth of complexity. So I'm not going to go into everything on this, but I just want to use it to point out a number of different places that power laws show up. So on this first line, we're looking at fractal dimensionality, and the form of that variable is another version of a power law. Whoops, I'm not sure how I just did that. Very good. And it takes the same form as the equation for entropy. They're both logarithmic. And I'll go back here because we'll talk about So power laws, like I said, with the family tree, right? Every time you go back a generation, you get twice as many relatives. You have 2 parents, you have 4 grandparents, you have 8 great-grandparents, you have 16 great-great-grandparents. As a fun side note, you only have to go back to the 1500s before your number of ancestors in that generation equals the population of the world. And so this is the power of exponential growth. And so when we're looking at logarithms, are just exponents turned inside out. So if we look down here where we see 10 to the 1 equals 10, 10 to the 2 equals 100, that exponent is just telling you how many zeros you're going to plug on to the number that it equals. And so the exponent is increasing linearly, 1 step at a time, 1, 2, 3, 4, whereas the power, 10 to the first power, is increasing exponentially, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000. And logarithms just you take the logarithm of the big number and it gives you the exponent. So it's taking the exponential jumps and it's giving you a linear scale. And so if you take the log of 10, you get 1 because 10 to the 1 equals 10. If you take the log of 100, you get 2. It's counting the zeros. How many zeros are in 100? That's what a logarithm's asking you. 2, there are 2 zeros, so that gives you 2. And so you're flattening this exponential scale into a linear scale, which is what our senses do. When we talk about decibels of just noticeable differences in sound, what we notice is just a little bit louder is actually going to be an exponential jump in actual loudness. When we look at the brightness of stars, what we notice is, oh, that star is just a little bit brighter than this one. It's actually an exponential jump. And then the next level brightest star we see as another exponential jump. I'm going to say 10 times more, even though the variables will change as to what the multiplication factor is. And so all of these, power laws characterize our experience. So the Weber-Fechner law and Stevens law are both laws of logarithmic perception. So in brightness, in sound, in earthquakes, all of these things are characterized by power laws. Like a 4.0 and a 5.0 aren't just like 1 time greater than each other. It's an exponential jump in power. Kleber's law, which I'm going to talk about in the next lecture, is looking at how all animals are related by a fractal dimensionality of metabolism to mass, so that the greater the mass, the slower the metabolism per mass. So it takes less energy than it does increase in mass. That'll be explained better later. We'll leave it for now. The Arrhenius equation is a reaction rate by temperature, and pink noise is frequency, relationship between frequency and power. But entropy is the one I want to talk about because this takes us out to that next larger iteration of the universe informing the earth, informing humanity, and noticing that we can look at entropy as a fractal dimensionality of the universe. And so as entropy is increasing, this tendency towards equilibrium with its partner of increase in complexity through dissipative structures, we have an increase in the fractal dimensionality of the universe. And so this is one of the places that my research takes me. I'm just going to close here real quick by noticing some of these pieces again. Fractals, they illustrate this complexity unfurling at the interface of difference. So just bringing us back to those dualities that we were sensing in the beginning of grief and love. There's a complexity that emerges there in this dialogue between these two dualities that creates beauty. There's the mirroring of self and other, and self and capital S self. There's an honoring of uncertainty and wildness and roughness that comes with this. And these fuel the goals of the PCC program. So the first goal is to open our consciousness through learning and imagination, to those creative and evolutionary energies that suffusing the earth, the universe, and the deep psyche, so that we're able to participate fully in the regeneration of human communities and their enveloping life systems. And so to me, this dynamic of fractals, infusing the universe and the creation of structures, the large structures that we are embedded within, infusing the structures of life on earth and how those play out, and infusing our internal dynamics of our sense of memory and participation in time, and how we hold dualities in our psychology, are all infused with this structure creating property of the interface of difference that fractals illustrate so beautifully. The second goal of the PCC mission statement is liberation from alienation and oppression. And this model of recognizing the fecundity of the dialogue between difference is fundamental to honoring the differences between human beings and between humans in the natural world, and allowing that dialogue to create something new and flourishing. It also allows for it honors the difference and allows for the mirroring of the self in the other, in those recognition that helps when those patterns map onto each other yet have important differences also. The third goal is drawing from the wisdom traditions to envision a vibrant planetary era, one of those wisdom traditions being math and science. And so we can use math and science as a road back to wholeness rather than away from it, as it has kind of gone. If we want to talk about Jean Gebser's structures of consciousness, we have been pretty solidly anchored in the mental structure of consciousness, which is this rational either or kind of thinking. And we're trying to get to, or, having tasted the beauty of the integral, which allows for a transparency and an honoring of the structures that came before the mental, the mythic, the magical, the archaic. And so fractals are one gateway that we can do this. We can start to see how the math and science can actually honor and tap back into some of the deeper wisdoms that was held before any of this way of talking about the world was developed. And I'm just going to close with Joanna Macy's Spiral of the Work That Reconnects again, because it beautifully tapped onto another quote from Martine Fractal that I'm going to share, because this movement from gratitude, from feeling our love in the present moment, honoring any losses that might be there, any pain that might be there, and the seeing with new eyes as a flowering and a going forth and a seeding the world is beautifully illustrated in this painting by Joanna's friend Dory Midnight. So the quote I'm going to leave you with is, if you bring your broken heart to the forest, the desert, ocean, the steppe, the jungle, where no people interrupt your presence, you will have your own loud internal clatter to calm before your grief will truly make itself known. Then you must gather yourself without frowning or gritting of teeth. Concentrate on making your heart into some flower. You will know if you're in the Americas and it's summertime, because sooner than you think, hummingbirds will begin to flock and buzz around you, fighting to be the first to drink the nectar of your grief flower right off your chest. Then you must weep for wonder of the joy at seeing your losses become beauty through grief that hummingbirds can drink as something sweet. The birds are metabolizing your losses through the praise that is the animal itself. By turning all your grief into a state of wonder, you are a person who can live if you can call and feed the animals to drink the beauty you've become from grief. And so with that, I'll close and open for questions. Thank you all so much for listening.
All right, thank you, Carrie, so much for that presentation, which took us from profound meditation and personal reflection into both our own depths and the cascading depths of the world and of mathematics and its ability to disclose the world. It's extremely rich, and I'm very grateful for it. Right now we have some time for questions from everyone who's in attendance. And again, let me just remind you of how we're going to do this. We have about we have up to about 30 minutes for question and answers. So there's a lot of time. We may not need it all, but we'll see. If you've got a question for Carrie, please use either the raise hand function or tap your questions into the chat, which I believe we're going to reopen. So you can do either way. And again, let me also remind you to everyone who's in attendance today, thank you so much for being here. If you've got any feedback, that's not a question for Carrie, but just thoughts you have on the presentation and so forth, please do use our feedback form, which you can see in the chat box as well. So with that said, let me look at my gallery here. Does anyone have any initial questions for Carrie? I see Carol is going to get us started today. So Carol, please unmute yourself and go ahead.
Thank you. I was trying to wait. I was hoping somebody else would go first, but Carrie, that was amazing. Thank you. And having had a class with you, I was like, wow, I learned so much that's new. Thank you so much. You said the most amazing thing, and I'd like to get the language down. What was it you said about complexity at the boundary of difference, complexity, something, something? And I'd like to share the complete spiritual insight, the amazing spiritual insight that came to me when you said that was that, oh, that's why we have to have an incredibly empty mind in order for the universal consciousness to show up in our minds. I was like, oh, those two ideas connect. So please, what's the language about that?
Yeah, it's just complexity unfurling at the interface of difference. And we can think about this in terms of entropy, which we normally think of, hot to cold, hot spreading out and slowing down into the universe until striving towards equilibrium. But it actually does this more efficiently by creating structures within that spreading down and slowing out. So the gradient between hot and cold that is created, this flow that is created between these two dualities, unfurls complexity in order to break down the hot into the cold. Like that's what the earth is. The earth is the complexity unfurling at the difference between hot and cold of the sun and the rest of space. In permaculture, it's called the edge effect, where you have the edge of a pond and a field and you get the greatest diversity of life at that edge between these two ecozones.
Yes, I think I'll never stop thinking of you and dissipative structures when I stir anything with a spoon. Thank you.
Thanks, Carol.
Thanks, Carol. Elizabeth.
Yes, hi. I really enjoyed the depth of your presentation, and I couldn't help but notice there was a citation on one of your images about play and art. And the journal was about like the American Journal of Play or something to that effect. And I was wondering if you had any comments to elaborate on the connection of fractals and play.
Oh, love it. Great question. So that image was from Terry Marks Tarlow, that was her article and her image. And it was for those of you who didn't notice, it was the coastline paradox one where the Koch curve has the different size measuring sticks on it. And so the relationship to play, gosh, because of this unpredictable nature of fractals, and specifically, they do a really good job of carrying the duality, right, of predictability and unpredictability. So there's a pink noise signature that shows up in speech and music in a lot of different places where there's certain long, slow frequencies that have greater amplitude that give us a general overarching structure. But then within that general overarching structure, there's shorter, faster frequencies which change things up, right? So it's the general trajectory of a song that we can feel where it's carrying us, and then it gives us a surprise, and that's what keeps us engaged in trying to figure out what it's going to do next. And so it's this element of the surprise within the predictability, again, this interface of duality, that engages us and keeps us wanting more, and looking in stimulates the dopamine system. Anytime something unexpected happened, the brain's like, let me do that again so I can figure it out. Like repeat it so I can figure out what the pattern is here. And when things continually feed us novelty, it keeps us engaged. And inherently that's what play is. It's this spirit of novelty creation and bottom up emergence of whatever wants to happen in the moment. In its most pure form, but then you can have games which have rules, but then within the rules, there's got to be enough interesting unexpectedness to happen to make it a fun game, right? And so I don't know if you had more thoughts on that or.
No, I love that. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks for that question. That's a great one.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Wendy.
Hi, Carrie. Great job. Very, very beautiful presentation. And I just wanted to give you the opportunity to speak a little about your own experience as a student in PCC and your vision for becoming a professor.
Great. Thanks so much, Wendy. I mean, it's interesting because I've been teaching for CIIS for, since 2010, basically. It's really a continuation of work that I've been doing for a long time. And it's really just engaging students in their own personal process of discovery and supplying materials and inspiration and seeing where they run with it, and kind of sculpting a track for them to play within, giving an overarching structure. But really the joy of it is in watching it get digested in all the individual people and how it interfaces with their specific individual interests and comes back and enriches the world. And so it's just a process that I've really enjoyed being part of and hope to continue playing in. Yeah, thanks for that question, Wendy. Nice to see you.
Thanks, Wendy. Carrie, I see that Keika had asked a not small question in the chat. How do we know what is actual? So I'll go ahead and repeat that for you and see if you wanted to respond at all.
How do we know what is actual? That is an excellent question. And I imagine that's probably in reference to something I said in the presentation. And gosh, I'd really like to get into like the etymology of that word, but I don't know it off the top of my head of what is the actual. But to me, it's foundationally experiential. Anything you experience is actual. It may not be actual for anybody else, but there are like these degrees of actuality, I would say, in how much it's if it's true for you, it's true. It may not be true for anybody else, but that's where we come to, into dialogue with each other in discerning, where we have overlap and where we don't, and coming to understand either side of that. And I've often said in my studies, when I describe my undergraduate degree being in philosophy, religion, and physics, people are sometimes confused, like, why would you put those things together? But to me, they're all trying to figure out what the heck is going on using different tools. And so where they overlap, to me, that is the most true. And it's not to say that the places that they don't overlap aren't true also, but it's fun to find those places of overlap, I think, as it's exciting to be seen and recognized across difference, and so that actuality that happens in the overlap, when it's like, oh, you see this? Oh, I see that too. Yes, there's this thing we can agree on that feels good. And the difference feels good too, because if it was all overlap, how boring would that be? So lots of degrees of actuality, I suppose. And how do we know? I mean, it's highly individual, I suppose. Many ways of knowing.
Keika, did you want to follow up on that at all? Just to give you a moment. I know you may not be able to. Not everybody has their mics on.
Thank you, Jake, and thank you so much, Carrie. Nice presentation. And I just wanted to, just one follow-up question, that if it is individual experience, then why are we studying what we are studying?
Yeah. I mean, because we're trying to find where those experiences overlap and where they diverge. And that is the ground that we're playing on, and that's what we're trying to figure out. Like, we're even trying to figure out our own experience as we live it and as it changes through our dialogue with others. And so why are we studying what we're studying? Is it to get to the actual, I don't, I mean, ultimately it's why do we incarnate, in my opinion, and it's to play in the diversity. Yeah, I don't know that I could, and not just play, but to come back to the mission of PCC, to create this mutually enhancing relationship with the earth. Like, we can see where things work well and are life enhancing for larger numbers of beings, and we can see where things are challenging the life enhancing qualities that are inherent in the earth. And the desire to want to have it be life enhancing for as many beings as possible, to me is definitely a reason for doing the work. Play is life enhancing. I see the comment. Yes, it is, totally.
Thank you so much, Katie.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
Thank you. Elizabeth.
Hi, Carrie. Thanks so much for that truly integral presentation. It was really great to learn more about your work, which of course I've known, but not directly through being in your classes or anything. So I have two questions that are pretty different, but since we have time, I am going to ask both of them. First, I wonder if you could reflect on the political implications of this great phrase, complexity unfurling at the boundary of difference. It seems to me that it could have some, and I'm curious how you think about that. And I don't mean electoral politics, but just sort of power in society. Do you see any implications for that? And then the second question has more to do with research. And if you could discuss with us some of the approaches and methods you use in your own research, and how you like to share it with the public or with academia, or the avenues that you use for disseminating your own research. Thanks.
Awesome. Two excellent questions. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And so the complexity unfurling at the interface of difference is absolutely a call to recognize our own privilege and to expand our spheres of knowledge beyond that, to interface with difference. That is where growth happens. And people in marginalized communities are already interfacing with the difference of people in the high. It's like a pyramid. When you're on the bottom or on the outskirts, you have to deal with the people in the middle or at the top, right? It's only when you're in the middle or at the top that you can ignore those in the periphery. And so it brings this call for all of us to recognize those points at which we are in the middle and on the top, and to expand and open and look beyond those others we're in dialogue with in the middle or on the top, and to listen to the experiences that might be wholly other than our own personal experience and those in our immediate spheres, and to invite those experiences into our immediate spheres as much as possible. And one can do this interpersonally. We can do it through reading. We can do it through what we watch. We can do it through how we use our purchasing power. We can do it through just our interactions on a daily level. I was like hanging my laundry on the line the other day. I'm like, this is the great work right here, just using the wind and sun power that has naturally arrived to like align myself within that flow of energy, rather than a flow of energy that's a little less sustainable. And so, because the earth is part of that periphery, that has been subjugated and ignored and taken for granted. And so every time we open, not only to the earth, not only to indigenous people, not only to people of color, to women, to recognizing histories that have not been told, that our path forward becomes more clear. Yeah. And so, and then to the other question of research methods and approaches and dissemination. So my style of research is really looking for patterns and seeing how those patterns line up, and letting my brain follow its own curiosity. And so like looking at the pattern of like, oh, the equation for fractal dimensionality and the equation for entropy is the same equation. They're both power laws. How can I relate these two things to each other? Who has already been relating these things to each other? How can I use this mirroring that's happening here to see how that could inform understanding other systems that are also governed by power laws? And so just like when we translate between two languages, we gain information either way. Like every time I look at a different power law, I gain information that then I can use as a metaphor to look at other systems that are governed by similar principles. And I can test out how closely that metaphor might adhere to the new system, what new information it might bring that's really helpful for informing an understanding of that system, or where it might stretch beyond. And this is something that I really utilize in my classes also, because we're starting with the foundation of the scientific principles, but then the applications are very wide and vast, as you can see, as far as spiritual or psychological applications go. And how do we facilitate that dialogue between what is the scientific ground of how we've discovered this principle, and how can we extrapolate from it without overreaching? And so it's this continual dance and dialogue. And as far as dissemination goes, I have one book that I self-published and another one in the works that is The Texture of Time, same class that I'm going to be teaching in the fall. And so if I could get it done before that class, then it would be available for people to read then, which would be ideal, in the editing phase, halfway final edited. And I've also disseminated portions of that via a blog, and have taught public classes on these subjects also. Have done some collaborative work with a researcher out of Iran who's very much in the mathematical mode of developing fractal calculus, and kind of helped provide a broader context for his work and layers of language and interpretation to situate it within broader scopes. And so that's been very fruitful, actually, because he's quite a prolific publisher, and has been happy to carry me along with him on that journey. And so it's nice to have those collaborations as ways of dissemination also. Academia, a lot of my work is up on academia.edu and receives quite a bit of traffic and attention that way. And then it's just freely offered. So there's not, that's kind of the ideal, is to make it accessible, which is why I haven't necessarily gone through academic publishers who are going to make books way more expensive, and or journal, I need to get some more journal stuff done, but I've also neglected it because of, it can make it harder to access those materials. So I just often put it up for free. And I often find that anybody who's going to find my work is just going to find it via an internet search. And so, of course, additional methods would bring in additional streams of attention too. But that's my general approach so far, and welcome feedback and that also as I grow as a scholar. So thanks for that question.
Thank you for such a thorough answer.
Let's go to Matt and then Wendy. Just trying to bring in voices who haven't spoken yet, and then we'll get to you, Wendy. Thanks.
Thanks, Jake. Hey, Carrie. Really great to have the opportunity to learn from you this morning. I'm going to resist the opportunity to just geek out with you for the next half hour and try to ask a simple enough question to draw you out a little bit on rationality. And, I love the way you started. I'm sorry to hear about the loss of your cat. I know how painful that can be. But in thinking about rationality and how to come to better grips with it, it seems like many have proposed that that is precisely what differentiates the human from other animal species. And so I wonder if we connect rationality and ratio etymologically to counting, measurement, etc., which can have both a qualitative and a quantitative dimension. There's a Hegelian triadic process here that Sean can help us with, maybe how measurement presupposes both a qualitative distinction and a quantitative kind of counting operation and procedure. Anyways, the point I want to draw you out on a little bit is similar to Elizabeth's question about the politics here. Obviously, measurement is a politically fraught endeavor for various reasons. When we engage in public policy, we want to draw upon science, but depending on how we perform various forms of measurement, the values informing the choice around what kind of ruler to use, can have severe consequences for people on the margins, as you were hinting at earlier. And so when we think about the importance of science for helping us form public policy, in your view, having studied these various paradoxes of measurement across the sciences, how do you, from your point of view, think, what lessons have you learned, I'll rephrase, ethically from your research on these paradoxes in the sciences? And what would you say to those who want to use scientific knowledge to develop public policy in light of what you've learned?
That's a big question, Matt. A lot of pieces in there. Let's see. So the role of science in policy development obviously has been hugely polarizing as of late. Depending on how you define late, decades even. With climate change, with vaccinations, this idea of what information can we gather, can we trust? How do individuals relate, understand, trust information that's been gathered, particularly individuals who have been historically experimented on or not told the truth with regards to health or science has been used specifically to oppress them. And so having this notion of a very culturally, historically informed understanding of how science has been used can help us understand some of the mistrust of it. And at the same time, holding it gently and softly, and I really like Gebser's structures of consciousness for figuring out how things fit together and how to hold a multiplicity of perspectives, right? So science and measurement is landing in this mental structure of consciousness. We also have mythical structures of consciousness infusing us and the people around us, which might be a more religious, spiritual, storied way of taking in and interpreting the world, which is going to have wisdom that's important for the scientific pieces to take into consideration. And then there's the magical structure of consciousness, which is going to be, all forms of magical thinking or more synchronistic ways of seeing and thinking about the world. And it's like, oh, if I'm sick, maybe that's just because my psychology is out of alignment or something. And if I can just fix that, then my physical body will come into alignment. And while that might be fine for an individual, how much of that do we want to impose on others and say, oh, you have cancer because you're thinking something wrong? So there's all these different pieces at play that have validity and power, and need to be considered in the dialogue. And I think fundamentally that just by considering them all and allowing them to have reality and truth, even if only in their sphere, only if for that person who's believing that, yes, that is your truth, I accept that and I honor that. Then the dialogue with because often the science is delivered with this definitive end all be all, this is the way it is, no questions asked. If you question it, here's the divide here's the polarization that we're dealing with right now. And it's really allowing for the dialogue to take place that's going to make the science better. And is going to make people feel acknowledged within it also for their own individual depth and richness of experience. And so I don't know if that answers your question specifically, but that's what came up for me in mulling it over. Yeah,
I appreciate that. I know there's no simple answer, so I appreciate you sharing your reflections with us on it. I appreciate just holding the complexity. I think you did that well.
Thanks, Carrie. Let's go to Wendy and then Sean.
Thank you. I just wanted to be a voice in this arena for calling for this connecting of the ideas that we explore in PCC to be grounded in our collective understanding, such as our understanding of fractals, for example. It was so important to me as a student to be able to make the bridge between the esoteric ideas that are being presented in PCC and grounding them in reality. And I really believe that the trajectory of all of this is to find that common ground between the two, like Carrie described as the edge of growth. So that's just a comment from an alum and a grad, and in support of Carrie's application.
Thanks,
so
Wendy.
much, Wendy.
Sean.
Hey, Carrie, thank you so much for that really rich talk. Matt was already getting into, not surprisingly, articulating some of where I was going with Hegel, who famously made a distinction between the bad infinite and the true infinite. The bad infinite for Hegel is a merely quantitative infinite. So just a sequence going on forever, right? Whereas the true infinite is the infinite or the whole, which includes the finite within itself. And it's a qualitative infinite as well. So I'm curious, one, if you're familiar with that distinction, but also because I see you actually working with it, which I was very happy to see. I mean, on the one hand, I was a little wary. I get wary when I see people appealing to quantum mechanics or any aspect of science to as a kind of ground for spiritual insight, you know, like the quantum spirituality, let's say, or something like that. And I thought, oh, maybe that's what Carrie's going to do. But in fact, I didn't see you doing that. I saw you doing something richer than that. By going, for instance, from like the fractal, which is in Hegel's terms, it's beautiful, it's fascinating. In itself, it's a kind of bad infinite, though. It's merely just an infinitely repeating sequence going to smaller and smaller scales. That's one kind of infinity. But then you go to the different kind of idea of looking at difference and complexity emerging on the boundary between difference, which to me is a more qualitative notion. So I see you working with both the sort of standard mathematical quantitative infinite, and particularly going down to just smaller and smaller physical scales and getting lots of insight out of that. And then on the other hand, I see you making very interesting moves with sacred geometry and you know, invoking the experience of the living earth becoming conscious of herself through us and so on, which is a more, to me, qualitative infinite. I'm just wondering if you're aware of this, if you're conscious of this move you're making, and if you here's the question: do you draw from Gebser, which I really like, the integral. Is there anybody else in the Western tradition, because you invoked the Western tradition and contrasted it with modern physics? Is there anything in the Western tradition that inspires you or that you can draw from to going back further than Berry and Gebser that can support you in this more qualitative engagement with the infinite?
Yeah, great question. One of the first ones that comes to mind for the last question of the Western canon, because obviously it's not everybody going either or Aristotelian logic, but Leibniz is one of my favorites in his monadology, in the sense that, and for me, I always envision it very much similar to Indra's net, and I think he may have actually. I looked this up to see if he was actually influenced by that imagery or not. Indra's net being, kind of a web of existence with a jewel hanging at each nodal point, reflecting every other jewel in the net. And you can take the jewels as an individual person or as a moment, as an actual occasion, whatever you want to put in that place. And for Leibniz, he's talking about the monad in a similar respect, and he's very much squarely in the mathematical tradition as well, having come up with calculus at the same time as Newton, and standing in this tradition of kind of Newton being thought of as the last of the magicians in the way that alchemy kind of fed into the development of science. And obviously Whitehead's process theology is influential also in his way of talking about, suddenly we've got the monad, we've got the actual occasion, we've got the concrescence of experience, we've got the negative prehensions informing the actual occasion. So these kind of, that's a great language for talking about the things on the periphery or the context, the entirety of the field informing the particle. And of course, he's informed in dialogue with relativity and quantum mechanics also. And so those are some of the names that come up. As far as like the dialogue between the quantitative and the qualitative, absolutely, it's always, those two are always hand in hand. And I'm specifically trying to use the quantitative as this bridge back to the qualitative, as something that humans often cling to for a sense of certainty, and allowing it to open us to uncertainty, and to beauty and magic and aliveness beyond simple calculated. And I think that's the beauty of it, actually. Like, I don't think you can actually talk about, I mean, obviously you can talk about, and I do appreciate Hegel's distinction, but between, the bad and the good infinities. I would quibble with terminology, but but a quantitative or a qualitative infinity. But I think that the idea of a quantitative infinity is actually not real. It's this thing that the mind wants to do, to say there is this thing that is separated from everything else, but it's not. There is no such thing as an abstract, like mathematics is always in reference to reality, in the same way Whitehead would talk about an eternal idea versus an actual occasion, right? This notion of an abstract, the fallacy of misplaced concreteness would be how I would dialogue these two together, that like the idea of a bad infinity is a fallacy of misplaced concreteness. It is an abstract idea that always arises from the concreteness of reality and is always in dialogue with the concreteness of reality, and does not exist only in abstract land by itself. And that the separating of these two is the problem. It's not the thing. It's not the bad infinity that's the problem.
Great response, Carrie. Thank you. I too could geek out with you for a long time, but I'll pass the baton.
Yeah, it was a fun question. Thanks, John.
So I want to make sure Carrie gets a break before the teaching demo. So I'm going to give the last word or last question to Carrie Crisp Vasquez.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. Question around your research has been most, I guess, common supportive concept, and also is common.
You're breaking up, Carrie.
Carrie, looks like we have a bad connection. We can't hear you.
Can you try maybe cutting your video and see if the audio will come out clearer? Try once more, maybe.
Or chat the question. Can you type it in the chat?
Okay, so Carrie says she'll save her question for later. You're gonna get a chance to see Carrie a couple more times today anyway, so we'll save the questions for then. Thank you so much, Carrie, for this morning. We have the teaching demonstration in just a little tiny bit over an hour, so it's a little break. I hope you're able to rest and enjoy it and get a little nourishment during that time. Thanks everyone who's been in attendance. It's lovely to see you all, and see you soon.
Thank you, everybody.